Sandra Reed pulled her worn coat tighter around her as she stepped into the grand lobby of Bennett Grand Hotel. The crystal chandelier overhead shimmered, casting a golden glow on the pristine marble floor. The sheer elegance of the place made her feel small. Her grip tightened around the tiny hands of Cletus and Lotus. 6-year-old Cletus curiously took in his surroundings, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the grand hotel. Beside him, 4-year-old Lotus clung to her mother, wide-eyed as she admired the fresh floral arrangements near the reception desk. Sandra knew she shouldn't have brought them, but she had no choice. Their babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and she couldn't afford to miss this opportunity. "Sit still and be good, okay?" she whispered. Cletus nodded quickly, while Lotus simply squeezed her hand tighter. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the interview room. Across the polished table, Margaret Hayes, the hotel's head of HR, regarded her with a sharp gaze. Seated beside her was a man in a tailored black suit, Arthur Bennett, the CEO. His composed, unreadable demeanor only made the room feel colder. Margaret's brows furrowed as her gaze flickered toward the 2 children sitting quietly in the corner. "You brought your children to an interview?" Her voice was polite but laced with disapproval. Sandra forced her hands to stay still in her lap. Yes, it was an unavoidable situation. Margaret exchanged a glance with Arthur. He remained silent, tapping his fingers lightly on the table as he skimmed through Sandra's resume. "Our employees are expected to maintain complete focus during their shifts," Margaret continued. "You understand why we have concerns?" Sandra had rehearsed this moment. She refused to let them make her feel small. "I do," she replied, her tone steady. "I've always arranged for childcare. Today was an exception." Arthur finally spoke, his voice deep and unreadable. "You have employment gaps." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "This job requires flexibility. If something comes up with your children, can you guarantee you'll meet our demands?" Sandra straightened her back, holding his gaze. "If I couldn't, I wouldn't be here." Silence filled the room. Arthur studied her as if assessing something unspoken. Outside, Cletus swung his legs under the chair, growing restless. They had been sitting quietly for a while when Lotus squirmed beside him, whispering, "Cletus, I need to go." Cletus glanced at the closed door where their mother had disappeared. He didn't want to disturb her, but Lotus's expression was urgent. "Come on," he murmured, slipping off his chair. "Let's find a bathroom." Hand in hand, they wandered into the vast hallway of the hotel, unaware that they were about to run into someone who would change everything. Cletus held on to his sister's hand as they wandered through the vast hallways of Bennett Grand Hotel. The polished marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the quiet murmur of luxury filled the air. Cletus scanned the surroundings, trying to find a bathroom sign, but everything seemed unfamiliar. Lotus tugged at his sleeve, her small voice uncertain. "Are we lost?" Cletus shook his head firmly, even though he wasn't entirely sure. "Nope. I'll figure it out." They turned a corner, and just as they did, thud! Cletus bumped into a tall man in a navy ghoul suit. Arthur Bennett. His expensive leather wallet slipped from his pocket and hit the floor, unnoticed by its owner. Cletus blinked, then quickly bent down to pick it up before Arthur even realized what had happened. The boy turned the wallet over in his hands, weighing it curiously. "This thing is heavy," Cletus remarked, tipping his head up at the man. "You should sew it to your pants so you don't drop it again." Arthur, who had spent his entire morning buried in back-to-back meetings and financial reports, was not expecting such an observation. He raised an eyebrow, looking down at the small boy. "Is that so?" he mused, his tone laced with amusement. Before Cletus could respond, Lotus peeked from behind her brother and gasped, "You look like a prince!" Arthur blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He glanced down at the wide-eyed little girl, her face filled with innocent wonder. "A prince?" he echoed, a rare flicker of a smile appearing. Lotus nodded eagerly. "Mom reads us stories about them. Princes live in big castles. Is this a castle?" Arthur glanced around at the Grand Hotel lobby before turning back to her. "You could say that." He crouched slightly to their level. "So, what are you two doing here?" Cletus responded without hesitation. "We're waiting for our mom. She's inside talking to the work people." The amusement in Arthur's expression faded slightly. He glanced toward the conference room where he knew HR was conducting interviews. "Your mom is interviewing?" he asked. Lotus beamed. "Yep, she's really good." Arthur didn't reply immediately. Instead, he tapped his fingers lightly against the wallet in his hand, as if suddenly reminded of something important. Just then, Lotus tugged at Clytus's sleeve again. "Clytus, where's the bathroom?" Clytus snapped back to reality. "Oh, right. Thanks for not losing your wallet again, Mr. Prince." And with that, Clytus grabbed his sister's hand and hurried off, leaving Arthur standing in the hallway, lost in thought. Sandra felt the air in the interview room grow heavier. Margaret exchanged a look with Arthur, who remained unreadable, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "Thank you for coming in today," Margaret finally said, offering a polite but distant smile. "We'll be in touch if an opportunity arises." Sandra knew what that meant. She had heard it too many times before, a rejection wrapped in formal courtesy. Forcing herself to stay composed, she returned the smile, though it felt hollow. "I appreciate your time." She rose from her seat, adjusted her bag, and walked toward the door. It closed behind her with a soft click, but she didn't allow herself to sigh. Clytus and Lotus were still waiting near the reception desk when Sandra stepped out. The moment Clytus spotted her, he ran up, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "Mom, did you talk to them?" Sandra smiled, though her chest felt unbearably tight. "Yes, sweetheart, I did." Lotus tugged at her sleeve, eyes filled with hope. "Did you get the job?" She hesitated for a brief second, then nodded. "Everything's fine." She couldn't let them see the uncertainty gnawing at her. They were too young to understand the weight she carried. Arthur stood near the elevator, watching them. He wasn't sure why he was still looking. Sandra held on to Clytus and Lotus's hands, leading them toward the exit. Her posture remained straight, her steps steady, but Arthur could see it, the quiet exhaustion that clung to her. Outside, the sky had turned a muted gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Sandra pulled her coat tighter, her heart sinking. She had expected this outcome, but somehow this rejection stung more than the others. Arthur stood near the elevator, watching as Sandra and her two children disappeared through the hotel's grand entrance. A strange feeling settled in his chest, a quiet pull he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't the type to let emotions dictate his decisions. Everything he did was calculated, strategic, but this time, something made him reconsider. Arthur made his way back to his office, yet instead of focusing on the reports waiting on his desk, his mind kept drifting back to Sandra, how she had sat with unwavering composure during the interview, unshaken by Margaret's scrutiny, to Clytus and Lotus, cheerful, innocent, blissfully unaware of the burden their mother carried. Before he could think twice, he picked up his phone. "Margaret?" His voice was calm, firm. There was a brief pause before Margaret responded. "Yes, sir." "Move Sandra Reed to the accepted list." Margaret hesitated. "Sir, but She's qualified," Arthur interrupted, "and she handled that interview better than most." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Margaret sighed. "Understood, sir." Arthur set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the city skyline beyond the glass. For a man who built his entire career on logic and strategy, this decision felt different. But when he thought about Sandra's unwavering composure and the hopeful innocence in her children's eyes, he knew, maybe, for once, he didn't need a reason. Sandra took a deep breath as she stood before the employee entrance of Bennett Grand Hotel. Her uniform was freshly laundered and neatly pressed, but that didn't ease the tension in her chest. She had worked in hospitality before, but never in a hotel this prestigious. More than that, she knew not everyone was happy about her being here. The moment she stepped into the staff lounge, she felt the weight of curious stares. "Who's she?" someone whispered. "The new girl. Heard she got hired even after bringing her kids to the interview." Sandra ignored the murmurs, keeping her posture straight as she approached Teresa, the head of housekeeping. The older woman didn't even look up as she handed Sandra her assignment list. "You're covering the East Wing," Teresa said briskly. 10 rooms before noon. Don't fall behind." Sandra nodded. Understood. She wasted no time pushing her housekeeping cart to the first room. Opening the door, she took in the pristine suite, the crisp white linens, the delicate chandelier, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. There was no time to admire it. Work began. She changed the sheets, wiped down surfaces, folded towels, arranged amenities. But it wasn't as easy as she had expected. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrestled with the oversized bedspread tucking in the corners. She aligned the pillows, ensured every detail was perfect. By the fourth room, her back ached, sweat beginning to form on her forehead, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Just as she finished smoothing the duvet, an irritated voice rang out from the hallway. "This is unacceptable." Sandra turned. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit stood at the door, holding up a towel. "There's a frayed thread on this towel," he huffed. "A hotel of this caliber should not have such carelessness." Sandra's instinct told her to apologize, but she did more than that. She retrieved a fresh towel from her cart, replacing it smoothly. Then, reaching for a small bottle from the amenities basket, she spritzed a light mist over the towel. "This is one of our signature scents," she said calmly. "We want to ensure our guests experience the highest level of relaxation." The man paused, his frown easing slightly as he inhaled the subtle fragrance. "Ooh, that's better." He turned and walked away without another word. Sandra let out a quiet breath of relief. She didn't notice that, from a distance, Arthur Bennett had been watching the entire exchange. At first, Sandra thought it was just a coincidence. The next morning, when she walked into the staff lounge, a fresh cup of coffee was already sitting on the table, right where she usually sat. No name, no note, nothing unusual, except it was exactly how she liked it. No sugar, just a splash of cream. She frowned, scanning the room, but no one seemed to pay her any attention. The following day, a neatly packed lunchbox appeared in the same spot. This time there was a small note attached: "Eat. Don't skip meals." Sandra stared at it. Who would do this? She lifted the lid. A simple, balanced meal, just like the one she usually made for herself. Then, another morning, as she reached into her locker, she found a pain relief patch, carefully placed where she couldn't miss it. Her fingers hovered over it, a strange warmth settling in her chest. Someone was looking out for her. Not in an obvious way, but in the smallest, quietest ways. And there was only one person who could have noticed these things: Arthur Bennett. But why? Sandra made a decision. She wouldn't acknowledge it. If she didn't acknowledge it, it wasn't real. But the next day, as she wheeled her housekeeping cart down the hallway, Arthur happened to pass by. He didn't stop, didn't look directly at her. But his deep, steady voice reached her ears as he walked past. "You didn't skip lunch today, did you?" Sandra froze in place. How did he know? That evening, Sandra stood in the hotel lobby with her two children, Clytus and Lotus, both clutching her hands tightly. In her other hand was a sleek, gold-embossed envelope that read, "Employee of the Quarter, complimentary stay in a VIP suite." She still couldn't believe she had received such recognition. A part of her felt out of place, but when she saw the excitement in her children's eyes, she knew she had made the right decision, to share this moment with them. "We're staying in a really nice room tonight," Sandra said, smiling as Cletus's eyes lit up. "Will there be a big bathtub?" Lotus asked eagerly. Sandra chuckled. "Of course, sweetheart." After checking in, they made their way to one of the most luxurious suites on the top floor. Lotus ran to the giant windows, pressing her tiny hands against the glass to admire the glittering city below. Clytus, ever curious, explored every corner of the lavish room. "We really get to stay here?" Clytus asked in awe. Sandra ruffled his hair. "Just for tonight, but yes." After helping the kids into their pajamas, she finally took a moment for herself, stepping into the warm bath. When she emerged, her hair still damp, she wrapped herself in a plush white bathrobe. She had just stepped into the room when the door suddenly swung open. A tall figure stepped inside, Arthur Bennett. Sandra let out a startled gasp, stumbling backward. Her foot slipped on the tile, her arm flailing for balance. Crash. A wine glass tipped over, spilling deep red liquid across the pristine white floor. Arthur froze. From his angle, the crimson stain looked alarmingly like blood. His expression darkened as he instinctively pulled out his phone. "Call an ambulance." Sandra's eyes widened. "Wait, I'm fine." Arthur's sharp gaze scanned her from head to toe before stopping. Sandra stiffened. She was wearing only a bathrobe. The room fell into a heavy silence. Before anyone could say a word, a small voice broke the tension. "Monsieur Arthur?" Arthur turned. Clytus and Lotus stood in the doorway, looking at him with wide, curious eyes. "Mom, is he the prince of this castle?" Lotus asked innocently. Sandra wanted to disappear. Arthur cleared his throat, finally looking away. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Just then, Clytus's stomach rumbled loudly, breaking the tension. Arthur smirked slightly before pulling out his phone. "Have you all had dinner?" Clytus quickly shook his head. "Not yet." "How about pizza?" Arthur asked, glancing at Sandra. She hesitated for a moment, but when she saw her children's hopeful faces, she nodded. A while later, a small table was set up in the suite, with 3 warm pizzas delivered. Clytus and Lotus sat happily, chatting between bites. Sandra sat across from Arthur, watching her children laugh, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a little less alone. Dinner ended with Clytus and Lotus giggling, happily finishing their last bites of pizza. Sandra sat quietly, watching everything unfold. A simple meal, 2 happy children, and a man she couldn't quite figure out sitting across from her. Arthur Bennett, the cold, untouchable CEO who never wasted time on anything outside of work. And yet, here he was, not just sharing a meal, but actually being present, as if he belonged in this moment. At first, Sandra thought he was just being polite, but then she saw the way he actually listened to Clytus talk about school, how he absent-mindedly adjusted Lotus's napkin when it slipped. He cared. After dinner, Clytus let out a long yawn, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, I'm really sleepy." Sandra chuckled, brushing his hair back. "Then it's bedtime." Lotus yawned too, but before climbing into bed, she turned to Arthur. "Mr. Arthur, will you have dinner with us again tomorrow?" Silence fell over the room. Sandra froze. She didn't dare look at Arthur. Arthur didn't answer right away. He set his glass down, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said at last, his voice quiet but sure. Clytus and Lotus didn't dwell on the answer. Within minutes, they were curled up under the blankets, fast asleep. Sandra tucked them in carefully, feeling Arthur's gaze still lingering on her. She turned back to him. "You don't have to do this." Arthur crossed his arms, leaning against the table. "Do what?" Sandra sighed. "Spend time with me and the kids. We're fine. I'm used to doing this alone." Arthur studied her for a long moment, then took a step closer. "Maybe you don't have to be." Sandra's breath hitched. She didn't know how to answer that. Didn't know how to process this feeling. For so long, she had convinced herself that she only had herself to rely on. But Arthur, the man who kept his distance from everyone, was slowly stepping into her life. He wasn't making promises. He wasn't rushing. But in his eyes, she saw something genuine. Something she had never seen in anyone before. For the first time in years, Sandra allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to do this alone forever. And when Arthur said, "Good night, Sandra," she knew this was only the beginning. 1 year later, Sandra stood in the kitchen, carefully flipping golden pancakes on the hot pan. The sweet aroma filled their cozy home, blending with the sound of laughter echoing from the living room. "Mom, hurry up, we have a party today!" Lotus bounced excitedly, eyes darting to the clock. Clytus, now a little more mature, tried to act composed, but couldn't hide his excitement. "I already checked everything. Mr. Arthur will be on time, right?" Sandra smiled warmly at them. "Of course, he promised." She placed the pancakes on the table just as the front door opened. Arthur walked in, still dressed in his sharp suit, but with a smile that belonged only to this family. "Are we ready?" he asked, setting a small bag on the counter. Lotus ran up to him, hugging his leg. "Did you bring dessert?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "And what if I didn't?" Lotus pouted, but Arthur chuckled, pulling a small pastry box from his bag, her favorite treat. She squealed in delight and ran off to show Clytus. Sandra crossed her arms, eyeing him playfully. "You spoil them too much." Arthur smirked, stepping closer. He brushed a strand of hair from her face before pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "And you spoil them just as much." She laughed. A year ago, she never imagined life would turn out this way. From a struggling single mother to finding a job at Bennett Grand, and somehow finding someone who had been quietly watching over her the whole time. Arthur had never been the type to open up easily. But for Sandra and the kids, he had learned to be part of something bigger, a family. And today they were about to take the next step. Arthur reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He flipped it open, revealing a simple yet elegant ring. Sandra's heart pounded in her chest. She had spent years convincing herself she didn't need anyone, but hearing those words, spoken so simply, so surely, unraveled something deep inside her. Arthur took her hand, his grip steady, unwavering. "I want this to be forever," he said. "Not just you and me, all four of us, a real family." Tears pricked at Sandra's eyes, but this time she didn't hesitate. She nodded. Lotus and Clytus jumped up in excitement. "Mom said yes." Arthur squeezed Sandra's hand, then leaned in to kiss her softly. They weren't just pieces trying to fit anymore. They were a family.